I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry.
When the British Army waved the white flag of surrender at Yorktown, the fighting was over, and soon the war would be too. Great Britain's grip on America had been released.
A sense of relief flooded the American militiamen standing bloodied on the battlefield. Somehow, this was all over. The near 200-year relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies was severed.
This was the first time that a colony had removed itself from its mother country, and it had been done by underdogs. Yorktown birthed America the nation, but the war itself birthed America the identity. How did we get here? The waving of the white flag, the redcoats stumbling away, the militia made up of farmers winning the day. Where did this all start?
250 years ago, our nation was born.
America's story is veiled in mystique and folklore, marked by tales of valor and bloodshed. To understand America as we know it, we must understand where it began. I'm Bridget Miller.
I'm Macy Kendrick.
I'm Natalie Miller, and this is the Patriot Papers. Let's start right at the beginning in 1607. Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America and marked the beginning of English colonization on the continent. Fast forward about a century and some change, the British Empire had established 13 colonies on the east coast of America.
This was the era of European imperialism. The New World had been discovered, and there were many resources there that provided opportunities for Europe to benefit.
Spain came to America mostly for gold, which they found further south. France profited largely off of trading for beaver pelts with Native Americans, further into modern-day Canada. But as for the English, which we're most concerned about in this story, they profited off of various goods. Their North American colonies were situated on the eastern seaboard. In their southern colonies, plantations produced tobacco, rice, or indigo, and in their northern colonies, shipbuilding and timber were the primary goods. So British politics inform a lot of what happens in the colonies. The government in Great Britain had the power to impose taxes and regulation in the colonies and appoint and influence the colonial governments. The relationship between the two is intertwined, and it's key to understanding what's to come. So what can you guys tell me about what the British system of government looks like? What is it like specifically in the 1760s and 1770s? Well, I know that there's obviously a king. I think it's King George III at this point. Yes, you'd be right. King George III becomes king in 1760. So he's just starting out as we get into this time period that I'm looking at.
I know that there's Parliament and I believe House of the Lords.
Yeah, so Parliament is also a big governing body of the British governmental system. The House of the Lords is one of the houses of Parliament. And just to clarify, because this might come up in future discussion, a term used by the British is king in Parliament, and that basically just means the combined forces of the British king and both houses of Parliament. So as I said, George III rose to power in 1760. Prior to this, Parliament was allowed to tax the colonies, but they largely didn't. The issue arose with the colonies when they started to use this right that they had. And then something else that's important to mention, or I guess I should say someone else, is William Pitt. He'd been a prominent leader of British Parliament, he helped to unify the body, and he had a big role in Britain's imperial pursuits, so things pertaining to the colonies. Yet, George III's appointed officials pushed Pitt to resign around the time that George III rises to power. So we can see that when Pitt leaves, there's this shift of the imperial interest and operations done by Great Britain. This probably can be attributed to some of the tense relations between the colonies and Great Britain. And there's also a revolving door of leaders in Parliament after Pitt leaves, but at this time, generally, American taxes are being raised by those leaders. So the next thing I want to talk about is mercantilism. It's a core concept of this time period in the context of European empires and colonial expansion. What are the core components of mercantilism?
From my understanding, it's basically this idea that there's only so much power or wealth in the world. If any other empire gets any, that you lose some. So basically you want to keep wealth within your own empire.
And the way that they do that is by using their colonies as a market, essentially. The colonies are only allowed to get finished goods from the mother country. So if you're in Virginia, per se,
you can only buy your English goods.
Yeah, and it operates off of this sort of zero-sum worldview that Macy was sort of getting at. So it's the assumption of empires at this time that the wealth and power in the world is finite, so you don't want to share it with other empires, or you lose that portion of the pie that you have. And so, yeah, it does impact imports and exports and the economy, especially with colonial possessions. It makes them dependent on the mother country for finished products, and yeah, basically the only people that they can conduct trade with are the mother country or the other colonies held by them. So we've pretty much covered Britain's government to a good extent, but that's an ocean away from the colonists. What are the colonial governments like that are more impactful to the colonists?
They're very entwined with like the British system. I think the king or the royal parliament essentially appoints a lot of the people that are in power in the colonies. So it's sort of like it furthers the reach of the British Empire in the colonies through the governmental systems.
Yeah, governors for one are like appointed officials. Excellent.
As Natalie was saying, very similar to the British structure. I believe they have like colonial like legislatures and also rural governors, as she was saying. A very similar model to what's going on in London, but like at a smaller scale in the colonies themselves.
Yeah, they basically implement like many systems of what they kind of have for more localized governance over the colonies. These are all exactly right. I'll just go into a little bit more of the details, because these things might come up as we talk about how the revolution happens. So the colonial government is subject to British jurisdiction, and one of the ways that they do this is through royal governors. And I should just amend what I said earlier. They do appoint governors, but they appoint specifically royal governors. Not all of the colonies started as royal colonies, but by the 1770s, all but Rhode Island and Connecticut were royal, meaning that those governors would be appointed. And the governors are loyal to the crown, obviously, if you're appointed by the king. And they have the ability to dissolve the legislature, which is something that is kind of a foreign concept to me. But yeah, you can just dissolve the body and call for new elections. Then there's also governors' councils. They kind of are the upper body of the colonial legislature, but they also work to advise the governor. And then the lower body are the colonial assemblies, the lower body of the legislature, I mean. And they are elected by voters in the colonies. To our standards, the voting population is small and limited, but it was quite expansive for the time. Like 70% or so of white men are eligible to vote in the colonies. But generally, the colonies, beyond their just systems of government, they are enmeshed in British politics. For example, they too feel the burden of debt from the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This was a pretty much global war fought on many fronts, one of which was the American continent. It was fought against the French. The colonists are some of these people who fought in the American theater of the war, but they also experienced the war debt. So Parliament's view on taxing, at least getting into the 1760s and 1770s, is that the 7 Years' War was fought on their soil to protect these colonists, so they ought to pay for it as well. And they are subject to Parliament and what they say anyway.
Thank you, Bridget, for setting us up really great there with the British government system. And I think that's going to be very helpful as we talk about a lot of these acts that people have probably heard about in like grade school, middle school, but we're going to get a little bit deeper into them. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Sugar Act, which was passed by Parliament in 1764. So what do you guys recall about the Sugar Act?
What I remember about this is that this is kind of the start of a longer chain of acts and taxes that would be passed that would be unsavory in the eyes of the colonists. But I think the Sugar Act is kind of where I see things get going.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's a tax on sugar.
Yeah, so you both are correct. This is the first act by Parliament that really directly taxes the colonist in this way, and it's not the last by far, as we'll talk about. And it is a tax on sugar, but when I was doing research for this episode, it was actually really interesting to learn that the Sugar Act lowered the price of sugar. So what do you understand about what tacit consent is?
Yeah, it is basically unofficially or informally consenting to, in this case, consenting to the taxation and Parliament's right to tax. So by paying for these cheaper British goods, you are inadvertently telling Parliament, you have the right to tax us, and I'm agreeing to it by buying it and paying the tax. And this is the problem. they probably would prefer to pay for the cheaper goods, but they don't want to tacitly consent and set the precedent of allowing this parliament to tax them without what seemed as unfairly and maybe without representation, which will be a bigger issue later.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. That was a perfect explanation of kind of an hard to understand topic. When I think of a tax on something, I think of it being more expensive. So trying to understand why colonists were mad about this act, which made sugar cheaper, was very interesting to say the least.
No, it's so confusing the way that the British did it. But it's kind of, I think that's probably kind of what they were trying to do. Mm-hmm. It's sneaky. Like, you want to pay the cheaper sugar.
And so, along with making sugar cheaper in this way, the act also made it harder to evade taxes by trying to cut down on the smuggling, like I mentioned. So this included forcing captains to keep detailed logs of the goods on the ship, and also smugglers could now be tried by British-controlled courts and not colonial courts.
I don't imagine they would like that either.
Yeah, they're seeing this as kind of going against their rights as British citizens because they're no longer able to be tried by a jury of their peers. The Sugar Act served two main purposes for the British Empire. It wanted to benefit the British West Indies sugar plantations, as I mentioned, cut down on the smuggling of bringing French sugar into the colonies. And it was also used to try to pay off debt from the French and Indian War, which you mentioned earlier. And it was a way to raise revenue without taxing citizens in Britain itself. So this act was really felt harshest in New England because these are where these big port cities are, shipbuilding economies, and also where the largest rum distilleries are located, which use sugar and molasses. Therefore, we see New England kind of have the biggest reactions, including boycotts of goods. But the response to this act is going to be much smaller to acts I'm going to talk about later, and it is repealed 2 years later by the Townshend Revenue Act, which I'll also speak about later. So the next act we're going to talk about is the Stamp Act, and I feel like this is one people are a little bit more familiar with and definitely has a larger reaction than the Sugar Act has. So what do you guys remember about the Stamp Act?
It's a tax on paper goods. Mm-hmm. So I always thought, like, hearing it, it must be a tax on stamps, but it's actually not. Like, the stamp is what you get to show that you have paid the tax on the paper good. So if you get, like, I don't know, some type of certificate from a royal courthouse, they will stamp it to show that you've paid the tax on the document.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right, Natalie. And I found it interesting why this act always had a larger reaction to it than the Sugar Act. Like, I would be more mad if, like, my sugar started costing more, even though obviously we talked about that's not how it worked. I found it interesting that it's really this idea of paper is what gets the colonists upset, but it's because paper is used in so many, everyday processes, governmental processes, and there's no way to go around this tax like there kind of is with the Sugar Act. You can just not buy sugar stuff. But this one, you need paper to even just run the colonies on like a governmental basis. And so as Natalie mentioned, the way that this tax works is once you pay it, you get a stamp on a piece of paper or a document showing that you have paid this tax. And it was used for the same reasons as the Sugar Act, basically to pay off war debts from the French and Indian War. So the colonies were again not very happy about this. And this actually led to this Stamp Act Congress, which was a unified body of the colonies with 9 out of the 13 colonies being represented. And it was actually the first unified body of the colonies. And this body acknowledged that Parliament did have the right to govern the colonists, but it did not have the right to tax them. Their reasoning was basically that the colonies themselves were not represented in Parliament, therefore they cannot be taxed. This brings up the whole no taxation without representation that I'm sure most people are familiar with when they think about the revolution itself.
Yeah, and there's also a key primary source that showcased the debates in Parliament going on at this time in regards to the Stamp Act. One such is Jared Ingersoll's written while this act is being debated. So Parliament can see unrest in the colonies over the taxation that's already happened, the Sugar Act for one. And so they see the situation as it is. How do you think that they're going to react and respond to this?
I guess my immediate reaction would be that, like, they're all sort of like, well, it's whatever. Like, we can do what we want. We're Parliament. But I feel like that's a little bit unrealistic. I'm sure that people did have differing opinions on, we believe that we have the right to do this, or maybe we should be a little bit careful about what we're doing with these taxes.
Yeah, there's 2 lines of thought. The first is that taxation is essential to asserting authority over the colonies, and that it's necessary as a show of power, I guess. And then the second is that taxing the colonies is going to push them past the breaking point, continue these protests and this unrest, and that eventually they'll revolt, and that this could cause Great Britain to lose these colonies altogether. So while one side points to the Stamp Act as the point of unrest, the other sees it as the solution. It's very paradoxical. Also mentioned somewhat by Macy, and then also in these debates, is this idea of virtual representation. What is it, and what is Parliament's view on it?
So, from how I understand it, virtual representation is basically the idea in Parliament that the colonies are represented because they are British citizens, and therefore they don't need to have actual representatives going to London, but they are represented by the people already elected in Parliament.
Idea mostly by Parliament that they don't need to have their own representatives. The colonies don't need to have their own representatives because they are virtually represented by those in Parliament who will supposedly look out for their best interest. And Parliament is split on this matter as well, actually. Not everyone is fully behind this idea of virtual representation. The House of Commons is the lower house in the Parliament. It's supposed to represent all British subjects, voters and non-voters. So because colonists are British subjects and they just happen to be non-voters for Parliament, they are part of this population that is represented by the House of Commons along with everyone else. The thought with virtual representation extending to non-voters in Great Britain itself was that those who didn't vote were still represented because Parliament members were close enough to see the impacts on the people, and that these laws they would pass would impact them as residents of Great Britain as well. And so that kind of justified the way that it worked for non-voters in Great Britain. But how does this work with colonists as they are virtually represented, but the Parliament members are not close enough to see the impacts on them, and they don't have to experience these taxes that they're levying against colonists. So it's interesting to see how they're sort of extending this idea of virtual representation, but it doesn't apply the same because of the situation of the colonists.
Let's get back to what's going on in the colonies. So, as I mentioned, the Sugar and the Stamp Act are not the end of Parliament's attempts to coerce the colonies into submission. Next, we're going to talk about the Declaratory Act and the Townshend duties. So, the Declaratory Act passed by Parliament in 1766, and it was basically a response to the Stamp Act Congress. So this act, kind of interestingly enough, was like an older act from 1720 that gave Parliament supremacy over Ireland. So they're basically like bringing it back up to use it on the colonies. So this kind of gives you an idea of how they took the Stamp Act Congress. They're not a big fan. So it basically asserts supreme power of Parliament over the colonies. So this is kind of a big, we're going to do what we want to do with you from Parliament to the colonies.
I think declaratory is a good name for it, yeah.
So this act was passed unanimously by Parliament right after the repeal of the Stamp Act. So they might have repealed the Stamp Act, but they've now just passed this act that basically is like, we Parliament have power and legitimacy to tax you. And then next, the Townshend Act. Have you guys ever heard of a guy named Charles Townshend?
I have not heard of him, but I do know, this act is, the big one, if you will. It causes a lot of problems going forward. So I am familiar with, I'm guessing the guy who created it, Charles Townshend.
Yeah, I've heard of the name of the act, and I assumed it was somebody's name. I don't know why you just named something that, but I don't know much about the guy.
Yeah, so you guys are both correct. The act is named after Charles Townshend, obviously. He was the British Chancellor of Exchange. So basically, he's kind of in charge of trade and things like this. And he said that the colonies would accept an external tax, but not an internal tax. So this was kind of based off a speech that Benjamin Franklin gave. But sadly for Charles Townshend, he was wrong on what the colonies would and wouldn't accept. So the Townshend duties basically put a tax on imported tea, glass, paper, and paints. This would bring in about £40,000 for the British a year. But as I mentioned, Townshend was really wrong about how the colonists would take this external tax, and there's going to be quite a large reaction to this.
I just wanted to ask, what is the difference between what is meant by external and internal?
So as I understand it, internal taxes are taxes or duties on goods or services and income within a country or a colony. And then external would be taxes or duties or tariffs on goods shipped in or out of a country or colony.
Okay, so it's more about if you're doing international trade, I don't know if it's international, but trade out of the colonies versus just things that are within.
Right.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yes, that's a great explanation of external and internal. A very interesting concept, and I'm not sure why Charles Townsend thought that the colonists would react in any different way to one or the other, but he learned pretty quickly that they wouldn't. And so one example of how the colonists react to the Townsend Acts is John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. So these letters basically present an argument that these acts are setting a precedent that endanger the future rights of colonists. So interestingly enough, John Dickinson is not a Pennsylvania farmer. He's actually like a lawyer, but he wrote under this kind of anonymous Pennsylvania farmer title to create like an idealized American who's upset at this British treatment, trying to get support for his ideas. He does argue for peaceful protest against these acts, but not all colonists follow this model of peaceful protest. So we've all heard about tar and feathering, I'm sure.
Yes, we have.
I feel like it's really one of those things that you learn about in grade school when you're talking about the American Revolution, and it kind of sticks with you. But
No pun intended.
that was good. But yeah, so tar and feathering kind of takes off in the colonies at this time, and you can see it as a model of protest by the people being targeted, specifically like custom officials or informants. And one example of this is Andrew Oliver, whose job it was to enforce the Stamp Act. He actually had to resign from his position after a mob basically like ransacked his house. Not a great time to be like a British official in the colonies during this time.
Oh, for sure.
It's going to get worse too, so.
Yes. So this is just one example of how colonists used both print and physical actions to basically speak out against these acts that they saw as infringing upon their rights as British citizens.
Okay, don't worry, I'm still here. We just saved my sections for the very last. The more exciting stuff, if you will. So now we're sort of getting into the action. The colonists all over America were displeased with Britain's attempts to control them, but colonists in Boston were particularly aggravated. Boston specifically, as we've talked about, is a port city in the New England region, and Boston did become a hotbed of revolutionary sentiment during the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. The taxes were weighing on Bostonians, and things really came to a head in March of 1770. Boston had been growing tense at this time, with colonists kind of resisting the ongoing taxation, and there being troops sent to Boston to combat mobs after the Sugar and Stamp Acts were passed. There's a pretty large military presence there, just in case anything happens. What do you guys know about this idea of a standing army and what British subjects might tend to think about it?
From what I understand, isn't like in Britain itself, a standing army doesn't really happen during peacetime. So like the colonists are upset about this because they feel like it's infringing upon their rights as British citizens.
Yeah, I sort of see it as this like threat almost, like having, this is abnormal to us because we like in current day have a standing army.
Although when we started out, I'm skipping forward a little bit, but after we had established a constitution and gained sovereignty, we really didn't do this standing army thing in times of peace. In fact, it took until about World War II for us to not immediately demobilize after. So we really do have a holdover of this British idea of like no standing army during peacetime.
Yeah, and I think it's supposed to give people this sense of like safety almost. Like, yeah, the military is there to protect and defend, but also like having the military just in towns is sort of this idea that, I don't know, is a little bit abnormal to the colonists at this time. So all that being said, the redcoats that are in Boston aren't really viewed well by the people that are living there. This is kind of in direct contradiction to this idea of no standing army. Furthermore, the army that's there in Boston are residing in establishments in areas of the city, which is upsetting residents. When I say like quartering in relation to the American Revolution, what is your immediate thought about what that means? And hint, this is a trick question.
When I think of quartering, I think of this idea of like you have to let soldiers like into your home and stay there and cook and feed for them. But I do believe that that's kind of a misunderstanding, correct?
You are correct. This is a misunderstanding. This is something that what you just explained is how I understood it until like very recently. But soldiers aren't necessarily residing in private homes. They really weren't open for quartering, but that doesn't mean that they were just like, they had barracks or something, because they're obviously not, they don't have those, but they are residing in like different establishments in the city. So with this army being in town, eventually at some point, a crowd gathers after a fight breaks out one night between a British soldier who's named Private Hugh White and a Bostonian, Edward Garrick, in front of the customs house. As the crowd and the soldiers who join the mob eventually become more aggravated, a soldier is struck with something, as colonists were throwing things like rocks or ice chunks at the soldiers.
Yeah, so amidst all this growing momentum and chaos, a voice from the crowd yells, "Fire." And you could see how this is confusing to British soldiers who are armed, and the order to fire is usually fire. And they mistake it and think that their officer had given them an order. So the soldiers do fire around at the crowd of protesters. As a result, 5 colonists died from British fire. Crispus Attucks, the first casualty of the revolution, was of African and Native American descent, and he would actually later become an icon of the abolitionist movement. I feel like a lot of people see this event as the opening of the revolution, or at least the like violence and conflict of the revolution in many ways. So I'm curious, what do you guys think about such a major moment in the American Revolution being relatively small in casualties and caused by chaos, confusion, and perhaps an accident?
Yeah, I think this is interesting that this is a relatively small event in terms of like death toll or casualties, like you said. But I think the main thing that I take away here is this is their army firing on them. Like this is, as they see it, this is their own country's military turning on the own citizens of the country. They're British subjects at this point. And so for that to happen, this is a major escalation in the tension, not only in Boston, but sort of this growing resentment between the colonists that are in America and the British military.
I think that's a great point. And I also like how you kind of bring up this question of like, was it confusion, chaos, or like an accident? And I think that even if, this event hadn't happened here, I think the tensions that we've been talking about have really been building up that like eventually something would have happened. And I think once it did in this instance, it really became like a rallying call almost for people who had been feeling this strong discontent with Great Britain.
Yeah, these are excellent points and exactly what I was trying to get at. Just the sort of happenstance of it all. And like regardless of like the level or the magnitude of it, it was an expression of, or at least it could be seen by colonists as British violence against them. Like, these people are not going to defend us or protect us. We need to protect ourselves against them. And it's just interesting to see how this didn't really start with the British rolling in on ships in a formal military assault on the colonists. It was just a chaotic situation, and this happened.
Mm-hmm. So after the smoke had cleared and the men had been shot by the redcoats, those men almost became martyrs for the patriot cause, and the men who had fired upon the crowd were arrested. So newspapers and pamphlets published the events of the massacre, and to both sides, this was a very unsettling event.
I find this very interesting. This was, when I was learning about this was not something that I thought would immediately happen, and maybe it's just because, like, I'm so used to, like, the government not taking accountability for, like, the things that it does that aren't great. But I find this really interesting that they immediately were like, no, like, this is wrong, and that this was seen as, like, very upsetting on both sides. This is interesting to me, at least.
Yeah, I agree. Like, not that I would think that British citizens would be like, yay, but, like, for them to actually be like, no, like, this isn't okay was, like, that is quite interesting to think about.
Yeah.
So many men do go to trial for their parts in the events, including 1 officer, 8 soldiers, and then 4 civilians. In court, the British soldiers were actually represented by John Adams, who becomes like a pretty predominant founding father figure who we'll talk about a little bit more later. So all the civilians were acquitted, along with 6 out of the 8 soldiers. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and given reduced sentences. So as Parliament continues to lay these taxes and policies on them, the colonists are now aware of the consequences of resistance, and this only heightens the tensions. So this leads us to another really famous and important act, the Tea Act, which is passed in 1773. So this act lowered the prices of British tea, kind of similar into the ways of the Sugar Act, as we talked about earlier, in an attempt to persuade colonists to consent to the taxation on this tea. So this act basically allowed the British East India Company to bypass laws that required them to first pass their product through London before it could go anywhere else. Now it can go directly to the colonies. So similar to the Sugar Act, basically, if colonists bought the taxed tea, they are consenting to this tax. They are setting a precedent for letting these things occur. And the Sons of Liberty say no, which is a group that forms in the New England area, the Boston area, who are basically the early leaders of these revolutionary sentiments. So colonists react to this act with really large-scale boycotts. And they actually leave a lot of the tea sitting unsold on ships in the harbor because this was the only way for them not to pay the tax. And this kind of sets up an event that becomes quite famous. And Natalie, will you take us through that?
Yes. So back to Boston. Things are heating up here. And like you mentioned, the Sons of Liberty is a group of young male patriots who come from a lot of different walks of life and are organizing the event of the century, if you will, the Boston Tea Party. So the issue at play is mainly no taxation without representation, as we've talked about before, and this will continue to show up. But more specifically, the tax on tea, which Macy just explained for us. So why tea? Why would the British put a tax on tea?
I would imagine it's a very popular product.
That's basically it, yes.
Yeah, I feel like it's a very staple British, commodity.
Yes, the British realized that it would be a major economic win if they start to tax tea imported to the American colonies, because tea is the drink of choice for many colonists, and the British thought that they could really capitalize on this, since what were the colonists going to do? Not pay the tax? Well, that's actually really what the colonists do when they begin throwing tea into the harbor as an act of defiance. They do this to defy the British Empire, but also it's critical to avoid paying the tax. So other than just being defiant, what's the motive here? Like, why not just bring the tea onto the dock and burn it?
Well, as I, kind of said earlier, that basically if this tea was unloaded from these ships, the colonists have to pay this tax. So, like, if they were to take it off the ships and then burn it, like, they're still paying the tax. So it's kind of like, what does the British Empire lose? They got their money. But by throwing it into the harbor, like, essentially, they're like, you now lost this product, and also we didn't pay this tax.
Exactly. They are holding it on boats in the harbor because if it were to be unloaded, the colonists would be forced to pay the tax. So in order to not pay that tax, on the night of December 16th, the colonists boarded the Dartmouth, a ship with all the tea that was being held in the harbor, and dressed as Native Americans and began to throw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The damages would total about $1.7 million in today's currency. So this is a big economic deal.
Yeah, that's a lot of tea.
It's very destructive.
Yes. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the Crown introduced the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts. This would alter the issue between the colonies and Great Britain to expand beyond just taxation. The Coercive Acts are 4 acts that are introduced, and they're aimed specifically at the American colonies as a consequence for the Boston Tea Party. The Intolerable Acts are the Coercive Acts plus the Quebec Act, which we'll get into in just a second. The Americans perceived the Quebec Act to be aimed at them also, and it combines with the others to form the Intolerable Acts.
What you can see and kind of infer by the title of these is that the 2 of them are similar and include some of the same things, but it's based on who you're talking to. Coercive acts would be the view of Parliament Great Britain. They see this as coercion and sort of persuasion. And then the Intolerable Acts are the view of the colonists, first because it includes also the Quebec Act, which is their view of, like, it includes us, but also because they're calling it intolerable. It's not okay.
Yeah, exactly. So let me run through the Coercive Acts just really quickly. The first one is called the Boston Port Act, and this basically blockades Boston Harbor besides what is needed to supply the Royal Army. The goal here is to target Boston's economic sector, trade, and also to cut off resources like food to Boston. So this is a major escalation and pretty serious. The second one is the Massachusetts Government Act. This assumes that Boston has fallen under mob rule, and in order to preserve the peace, Parliament passed this act to create a new Massachusetts council appointed by the Crown rather than the governor. And this also allows the new royal governor to appoint judges and sheriffs. And so essentially the colony's judicial system is now monopolized by the Crown, and the future town meetings can only be held once a year. The third is the Administration of Justice Act, which increases the power of the governor by allowing him to move trials across the sea, and it essentially eliminates a jury of one's peers. The Quartering Act, which I think we're all the most familiar with out of these, applies to all of the colonies and not just Massachusetts. So this is a significant escalation. What are we thinking about this?
It feels like a lot of power is being shifted, and I could see how the colonists could see this as, like, punishment or, like, consequence for what's happened, but it does seem like a big shift of, like, power and rule and sort of taking away from colonists, I guess.
Yeah, like, this seems a lot more intense than just, like, attacks on, like, a good or something. Like, these are now acts that, like, are specifically, like, hindering, I mean, Boston, you're talking about blocking the port, like, now goods, like you said, food can't get into the city. The colonial body of Massachusetts can't meet. Like, these are, like, really intense acts that go far beyond just, like, paying a tax on a good.
Yeah, you're completely correct. And the last one of these is the Quebec Act of 1774. This act essentially extends the border of Quebec south towards the Ohio River and gave more rights for Catholics. So Catholicism is the main religion in France, and the French sort of inhabit the land that we know as modern-day Canada, although this is a British-occupied region. There are just a lot of French people there, essentially. And many American Protestants do not like the idea of being tolerant to their Catholic neighbors as they sort of encroach into America.
It just seems like at the same time that Great Britain is severely punishing the colonies, they're extending rights to Catholics, which is largely not what British citizens or colonists are or practice. They are largely Protestant. Religion is, I would say, a much more divisive issue in this time than what we're familiar with, but this seems very unfair to them. They're being punished heavily in all regards, and now Catholics are getting more rights at the same time.
Yeah, you're completely correct. So each of these acts I've just talked about is targeting a specific area of colonial life and is designed to make colonists suffer for what they had done, essentially. The British saw the Boston Tea Party as an act of treason, and now the colonists had to pay the price. The colonists' reaction was given what you would think, given the environment at this time. Even some patriots, including George Washington, who had originally questioned the radical notion of the Boston Tea Party and the Sons of Liberty, were now completely on board with this idea of, this is not right, we have to do something about this.
It almost seems like these acts did the opposite of what Parliament wanted. Like, they aren't being coerced, they're actually just making the colonists angrier and kind of almost like leading to their own demise in a way.
Yeah, and this really unifies the colonies as well, which is a surprise to Great Britain. This is not something that they were expecting. So, all in all, the Intolerable Acts moved beyond just the issue of taxation. Basic English liberty was now attacked. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies unite, and this becomes a major starting point for what is to come in the American Revolution. Unlike the acts that have come before it, Parliament does not repeal the Intolerable Acts. From the British perspective, they're dealing with the increasing risk of a rebellion in America. The task of quelling this rebellion in Boston fell to the Crown-appointed governor, Thomas Gage, who had actually helped to craft and enforce the Intolerable Acts. Naturally, this made him a rather unpopular guy in Boston. And Gage really knew that he was staring down the barrel of a gun at outright rebellion growing in Boston. In response to this growing rebellion, he was ordered to send the Royal Army to Concord, Massachusetts to seize Patriot arms and ammunition from a storehouse. Patriot spies got wind of this plan, and on the evening of April 18, 1775, Patriot leader Paul Revere was sent on his midnight ride to warn of the British's plans. What do you guys already know about Paul and his midnight ride?
Oh, it's infamous. I mean, there's I think it's part of almost American mystique and folklore.
Yes.
I think of him on his horse yelling that the British are coming. But am I right in thinking that he actually wasn't the only one who went on this kind of midnight ride?
You'd be correct, yes. He's the one that gets all the notoriety for it, but there were others. So Paul Revere himself is actually working as a colonial mailman, essentially. He's delivering messages for the Massachusetts Committee of Public Safety.
Talk about the most heroic mailman.
Yeah, no kidding. He was tasked by a man named Dr. Joseph Warren, who was a Sons of Liberty leader, to warn citizens of Lexington about the British's arrival. But there are two other men riding alongside Revere, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. All three of these men would actually be intercepted by redcoats. Prescott and Dawes escaped, but Revere was arrested and held for some time. Eventually, they did release him the same night that he was taken, but they took his horse, so he's forced to walk home. That's, I think, a part of the story that we don't often hear, sort of this, not a defeat, but, not the way he wanted his night to end.
That would damper the American folklore aspect that I just talked about,
right.
Certainly.
And it's almost interesting that he's the one we hear about when he's the only one who, got caught.
Yeah. Nevertheless, his night even gets more eventful because on his walk home, he witnesses the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So backtracking just a little bit, as Revere and the others were warning Americans about the British coming to seize the weapons and gunpowder, the Patriot militias began to march to meet the Redcoats. On April 19th, 1775, the militiamen met the Redcoats in Lexington. As the British army rushed towards them, the militia was ordered to disperse. Somewhat in the chaos, a shot was fired by one side or the other. In response, the British opened fire on the militia and 7 patriots are killed. The British then march on to Concord, and as they did, there are 400 militiamen from Concord who are seeing smoke rising and believe that the British have torched the town. They didn't, but nevertheless, they advanced thinking that this had happened. On the way back from Concord, Patriot militia start following the British and are killing dozens along the way. One of the Patriot militia leaders of the Acton Company, Captain Isaac Davis, is at the helm of the column of the militia. When he's asked if his men are prepared to confront the British troops, Davis remarked, quote, "I haven't a man afraid to go," end quote. I think this really shows, I don't know if I could, speculate that they're ready for this, but, there's this sense of we are going forward no matter what.
Yeah, maybe not, preparedness, but willingness, certainly.
Yeah. So when the British are met with this rather large militia, they retreat and prepare a defense. The British do fire on the colonists as a result, and the colonists fire back. When they have a shot, they take it, and this becomes the shot heard round the world. They kill 3 Redcoats and send the British troops retreating into town. The Patriot militia and the British army had reached a point of no return. Each of these events had escalated the conflict into a full-blown war. For the colonists, the Crown had crossed a line in the sand, and for the British, the colonies were committing treason. Things could not have been smoothed over, and war was on the horizon.
The 1760s and early 1770s saw a real turning point in how colonists viewed themselves in relation to the British Empire. While the Sugar and Stamp Acts angered colonists, ideas of colonial independence from Britain were still a far-off idea to the general public. Colonists were British subjects who wanted to be treated the same way as their fellow countrymen in Britain.
This time reveals a real disconnect between the colonies and the motherland. British policymakers saw these acts as fair. For Parliament, there was no need to discuss colonial representation. Parliament acted on their behalf and argued that they were virtually represented.
As clashes between colonists and the British continue, a shift becomes clear. In many ways, conflict is inevitable. As tensions turn into bloodshed, many Patriot leaders begin thinking about ways to unite the colonies behind a common cause, a revolution.